Okay guys, to recap on the last video when I was talking about is it possible to make planes from hemp, flax or material that's grown or vegetation that's grown to extract oils, fibres, etc. to make laminates, plastics, etc, etc. So, and what I was going to recap, what I was about to say in the last of the video is we have reached a pinnacle now in missile technology and explosives and rocket motors, jet motors, etc. that the days of dogfighting, air-to-air combat is practically over. Okay? We can make a missile so much smaller, so much lighter, so much faster, because there's no person inside it to black out from G-forces. It can pull way harder turns, pull massive G-forces without anybody passing out. And then by taking that human out of it, everything becomes smaller, lighter. The missile becomes smaller and lighter, travels further and faster. So, and computer technology has got so much more advanced that now we can have such a powerful little computer package, guidance system, etc. inside of that small little rocket that dogfighting is a thing of the past. And missiles are now we're stepping into hypersonic missiles. So even planes that can travel like a Joint Strike Fighter or a F-18 Super Hornet or, you know, F-16 Falcon or whatever, they're big targets. They're expensive. They've got humans inside them that cost a lot of money to train, house. They have loved ones at home that they need to spend time with. Then because they're so big and so expensive and they need a lot of maintenance and pilots and all of the kit that goes with it, they need to be fed, they need to be fueled, they need to be housed. So you need a whole Air Force base worth of logistical support to operate fighter jets. Okay? And really at the end of the day now, because of the dogfighting's over, so to speak, well, definitely in the future it will be, because now the planes are firing from way outside of visual range. They're firing like, you know, what a lot of modern missiles now can fire 80 kilometers, maybe 100 kilometers over the horizon. So it's not my point, this is only my opinion. So it's not important to have planes now that are extremely fast, extremely agile, extremely expensive with heaps of ground crews necessary, when you could have a very basic modern version of an old kinetic analog technology plane that just has the smarts where it needs to have the smarts, and that is basically communication and controlling the weapon system. So you could have a basic plane, propeller, piston engines or whatever are a lot cheaper than jet engines, especially to maintain, to fuel. They're way more economical, obviously not as fast, but we can make up for that speed in the missile or the rocket itself. So now what I'm thinking is you could potentially have something like this, a twin-engined wooden plane that's extremely cheap. It doesn't need to be a fighter. All it needs to be is a bomb truck. It's basically a utility pickup vehicle that carries extra big missiles compared to what a dogfighting one can carry. A dogfighting one needs to be able to maneuver, so it can't have really big things that's gonna hinder its maneuverability and performance with air-to-air combat. So now we don't need to do that. We have things that ideally are as small as possible so they're still harder to intercept. They can fly slow, so that means that because they fly slow, and they have propellers, which, you know, they're push or pull propellers. That means they're at low level. They're probably safer than jets. They don't put off as much heat, and they can loiter for a long time. They can just fly around in the ocean, a long way away from the battlefield. They can just fly around, and when needed, they can be called in to move forward and then fire their very long range missiles. Now, I've always believed that Australia should basically take a leaf out of China's self-defense book. We should be like a porcupine and echidna. Look to nature. Nature's got all the answers. You know, we just bristle ourselves with ballistic missiles. Okay, they're relatively cheap. They don't need Air Force bases and training for years and years and years through pilot schools and all of that, all the mechanical maintenance that goes on, changing engines and things like that. They're just modular. You can change out warheads quickly. You can change out guidance systems. You can change out rocket motors, fuel loads for further or closer. They're nowhere near the size of a plane. So the logistics are small. You could just have small little bases, but they can fire extremely long ranges. And if you've got big enough ballistic missiles, they can fire into the stratosphere or whatever it is, get out of the gravity belt and lob them up into space, lob them forward, let the world rotate around, and then they can re-enter. They glide up into space, let the world rotate around to where it needs to land, and then they can come down, break open into smaller warheads, and now rain down terror at whatever entry speed back into orbit is, you know, multiple thousands of kilometers an hour. And once they're up there, they're just loitering and they come down, so you only need the fuel load to get out of orbit or to get out of the atmosphere. Then from there, it's just gliding the way down. So a ballistic missile uses a lot of its fuel payload just to get off the ground and get up to speed and get to climb altitude. Now, if you had a plane that could carry 1,500 kilos to 2,000 kilos, that's probably what a good Tomahawk cruise missile or a decent size intermediate range ballistic missile potentially weighs. A short range to intermediate ballistic missile would weigh. Fired from the ground, fired from a submarine or a surface vessel like a ship, they're going to use a hell of a lot of its motor or propellant for the rocket motor or the fuel for the jet engine, turbine engine, just to get up to altitude and get to speed. So if you had a plane that could carry one of those or carry two of those, and it's just a very basic, crude, reliable, analog, nothing can be jammed to make the plane fall out of the sky. If you had something like that, exactly like a modern mosquito bomber or something along those lines, or an air tractor, AT-802 or whatever they're called, these things could fly long ranges, fly very low to the ocean, loiter around for a long time. They could potentially climb to altitude to fire their ballistic missile, get up around 10,000 feet, 20,000 feet or further, 30,000 feet, fire the ballistic missile on an upward trajectory from that height already, then the ballistic missile is going to go higher for longer, or further for longer. And then that's how we could get very cheap planes to fire fairly cheap, inexpensive ballistic missiles a hell of a long way away. And if you could use swarm tactics, you know, obviously we have the technology now, you know, where we can have communication to different radar systems, whether they're submarines, whether they're ocean buoys floating in the ocean that give you signals and things like that. Satellite navigation, but that potentially could be jammed. You could have people on the ground. You could have special forces soldiers with a line of sight, or a sniper or something with a line of sight, or even friendly troops from another country that are, you know, in the Philippines, in Thailand, in, you know, the South China Sea somewhere. And they could be targeting, and we fire a fairly cheap missile from a very, very basic cheap plane at high altitude, and we fire ballistic missiles, and, you know, they could potentially go, you know, 2,500 k's. The plane can go 1,000 k's out, 1,500 kilometers out over Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, up around that Malaysia sort of area, and then fire ballistic missiles from there, and then get them to land into the South China Sea somewhere, you know. So that's just a theory. Very cheap way of having some long-range standoff capabilities against surface ships, maybe submarines, potentially planes, you know, because a ballistic missile, as part of its warhead, you could have that so you could change out the missile system or the weaponry or the warheads. So you could have multiple anti-missile missiles. You could have anti-aircraft missiles. You could have anti-ship missiles. So as the missile's getting to near its final destination, as it's closing in on its final run, boom, it ejects the payload, another smaller missile inside it, or a number of smaller missiles inside it, and then they take off. A couple of those could just be dummy missiles that fly forward of the rear missile, or the real missile. So you could have 2 or 3 dummy missiles that they fly forward. The enemy ship or whatever it is takes out those 3, but the last one gets through. You know, that's just a cheap theory. Okay, I'll leave it at that. That's all I need to say. Don't need to go into any more depth. It's just food for thought.